It's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter with Netherland Sewell. We certainly appreciate the sponsorship of more than 20 years relationship with Netherland Sewell, and I'm excited to have them actually give some of their thoughts in and around this topic of carbon capture. Joe Mello is leading Netherland Sewell's carbon capture storage efforts, capitalizing on all the expertise on tertiary CO2 recovery and EOR projects that Netherland Sewell has done, as well as CO2 storage. So with that, I'd like to welcome Joe, and appreciate your time.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Aaron, for the introduction. So I guess today what I want to cover is kind of give you guys an introduction to something that we hopefully start seeing more and more of going forward, and that's investments into carbon storage and sequestration long term. You know, we're on the emerging edge of this industry. It's been going on for some time, but it really hasn't scaled up in the past several decades. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce you guys to some of the concepts that help build up towards a cash flow. So I'll start with touching on some of the technical issues that go with carbon sequestration, and then we'll look at some of the revenue sides and some of the costs that go into a typical carbon capture project, and tie it all together into cash flows and kind of give everyone a sort of a flavor of how these sorts of projects might compare to the traditional E&P space that everyone here is used to looking at and evaluating. So as an engineer at heart, you know, I like to deal with data, and so, you know, I think everybody has a sense that ESG investing is definitely becoming more and more important, but I like to back that up with some numbers. So this is just a little something I found using Google Search Trends Analytics. So the search frequency of ESG investing has grown by 10 times since 2017. So it's absolutely exploding. And what that means is that, you know, E&P companies in particular that don't embrace these sorts of ESG metrics and start tracking them and reporting them are going to get left behind as investors get more and more interested in companies that track themselves against these metrics. So, like I said, first I want to introduce just some sort of broad technical topics to give everybody a grounding in some of the key facets of geologic storage of carbon. So, at a very, very, very high level, there's kind of two broad categories of sort of technically mature storage options. You can put your CO2 back underground in an oil and gas reservoir that's either depleted or still producing in a form of EOR project. And on the other hand, you could inject into a reservoir that doesn't have any historical hydrocarbon accumulations, a saline aquifer well below usable water that has enough permeability and porosity to accept carbon storage. The things you're looking for in both types of reservoirs are generally pretty similar, but there's some distinct differences between them. You know, in both cases, you want high permeability for good injectivity in minimizing the number of wells you're going to need to store the carbon that you need to store for your project. You want a thick reservoir so your CO2 plume stays nice and condensed in a very, very, very small area because there's monitoring requirements that come with it. Smaller area, less seismic needed to monitor that plume over time. Leads to less costs. EOR reservoirs and depleted oil and gas reservoirs used for storage have some advantages. They typically are going to have more data. If you know how much you've extracted from these reservoirs in the past, you have a pretty good idea of how much you could put back in terms of CO2 storage. You're also going to have more wells probably, which will have more log data, more core data, you know, just generally more data available. Flip side of those wells, though, of course, it's more anthropogenic leak points. So, you know, as in a lot of aspects of choosing your site, there's pros and cons to both types of storage. These numbers of storage here, I put them in TCF kind of for folks in the E&P space to kind of get a sense of how these are in terms, instead of talking about metric tons, which is a little bit harder to get our heads around, at least for me it is. But EOR and depleted reservoirs have anywhere, DOE estimated, between 3,500 and 4,400 TCF of CO2 storage capacity. And those numbers come from sort of a patchwork of regional partnerships doing basin-wide estimates of their respective areas. On the other hand, saline aquifers have anywhere between 10 to 100 times that storage potential. So in the United States, the saline aquifers have a much larger storage potential, and they also have a couple other interesting facets to them, such as they exist in areas where traditional oil and gas activity hasn't occurred, and so there's not a lot of legacy fields to reinject into. A great example is in the Illinois basin, where there hasn't been a huge oil and gas industry over the decades, but there is a massive aquifer. And that's one of the, where some of the projects that are already ongoing, capturing CO2 from an industrial process and injecting into a saline aquifer, are going on. As far as what goes into a carbon capture technical forecast, where you're trying to estimate the volumes that you can put away in a given project, the evaluation methods and technical data needs are pretty similar to the E&P space. You're going to need logs, you're going to need seismic to define your structure and thickness, you're going to want to drill wells and take cores so you understand the petrophysical properties. And the methods we use are similar too, volumetrics and dynamic reservoir engineering simulation. But as in all aspects of oil and gas, carbon capture does have significant subsurface uncertainty as well. All the things that you don't know down to the nth degree of detail about your oil and gas reservoir are still uncertain in a carbon capture project. Permeability, you might have core data at your well, but what's the permeability like 1,000 feet away? You might have an idea that you have a nice regional aquifer, but what if it turns out that you're a little compartmentalized and you don't access the broad area? Those are some things that you want to consider very carefully when you're choosing your project and building your technical forecasts. Probably the biggest difference in a sort of a pre-injection carbon capture project compared to a pre-production E&P project would be that in a production sense, our best method for pre-production estimates, we typically like to map things up, figure out how much oil is in place, apply a recovery factor based on similar projects by analogy, and that gives us a good idea of what we might recover from the next project. Now, in the carbon sequestration space, there's not a lot of projects going on in the world. There's some, but odds are most projects, for the next several years are going to be projects that don't have a next-door neighbor to go look at in terms of trying to decide how much storage efficiency the reservoir is going to have. And so, contrasted to E&P projects, reservoir simulation takes a massive front seat in terms of designing programs and forecasting, just because those analogies aren't around. So a little bit more on simulation. Simulation is a tool that the industry has been using for some time to help evaluators understand complex behavior and quantify uncertainty around a project. So as I mentioned, there's all kinds of normal E&P uncertainties that you might have in a project related to the rock properties, related to aquifer size and transmissibility. CO2 storage projects, by virtue of an injection of CO2, which is not something that normally happens in E&P, there's some additional factors that can go on with the CO2 and the water interactions as it gets injected in the reservoir that lead to some interesting behavior. So for starters, CO2 dissolves in water to some extent. And that dissolution is a material component of the total amount of CO2 you can store in a field. And so that's something you want to capture and quantify in your simulation model so that you have a good estimate of the storage capacity of a field. As a result of that aqueous dissolution in the reservoir, there's a couple of other processes that can occur. For starters, as CO2 dissolves, it can form a weak acid with the water, and that can actually stimulate the reservoir as you inject. It can dissolve away cements that are in the pore space and actually improve your permeability and open up new pore space. On the flip side of that, you typically are injecting a dehydrated CO2 stream. For that exact same reason. You don't want any water in your CO2 stream to drop out, form an acid, and cause corrosion in your topsides. So the dry gas that you inject can end up picking up water that's already in your saline aquifer, vaporizing it, leaving behind salts. And so those salts can actually plug up pore space. So you kind of have those two processes that go against each other. Now, neither one of those are huge in terms of an absolute scale. but particularly in the early days of this industry where the revenues associated with carbon sequestration are maybe not as high as they might be in the future, you really want to understand all of the aspects that are going to impact your injectivity so that you don't find yourself in a situation where you're not able to put away the volumes you thought you would and therefore not realize the cash flows you thought you would. And this little graph I have here is just a little schematic of one example, saline aquifer simulation that we've done, and just kind of shows the different storage mechanisms as a fraction of the total CO2 stored on the y-axis there. And you can see during the injection period, while the graphs are ramping up, it's kind of hard to see, but right at the end of that, the dissolution of the CO2 is maybe 10% of the total injected volume of CO2 winds up in the water phase. And then over the subsequent 40 years, going out to year 50, that actually grows over time. And that's because that plume will migrate and contact new water, and more CO2 will always be dissolving as that plume migrates. Just a couple of additional geologic considerations that I have just to kind of discuss briefly. The one in the top left is one of my favorites. It illustrates the impact of vertical heterogeneity on a carbon storage project. So what we have are these two graphs, or two plots. They're just they're little cross sections of the reservoir. Blue on that cross section would be pure water, and then as it gets redder, it represents more and more of the pore space being occupied by CO2. The model on the right kind of represents just a purely homogeneous, the cleanest sandstone you've ever seen. You know, it's everybody's dream when they drill a well and find oil in that rock. On the left, it's also a very high net to gross rock, but you can see in the core photo there's little lamina. And they're not continuous, they're not very thick, but they're there. And those little shale laminas are gonna, as the CO2 migrates up from your injection point at the bottom of the reservoir, those lamina will help that gas diffuse out laterally as it goes up. So instead of going straight up to the top of the reservoir like it might in the reservoir on the right, on the left you can see it sort of diffuses out and occupies more of that column around the injection before starting to spread up dip. And again, you know, that's important because with monitoring requirements for CO2 storage wells, you're going to want to minimize that footprint of your CO2 so that you don't have to keep monitoring an area larger than you have to. And so that's what that dashed line represents. That kind of shows the upward extent for the exact same volume of CO2 injection on the right and left models. Is that the CO2 plume's much further up dip in the model on the right. The lower right-hand photos there, those are just some electron microscope pictures of an injection reservoir from a lab study. And it shows both of the impacts that I talked about earlier in terms of dissolving cements and precipitating out salts. So you can see those red circles on the left before and the right after are where some cements got dissolved over the course of a CO2 flood, and then those green circles before and after show where salt got precipitated out. So that's just a little illustration of that process I was talking about earlier. And then on the top right is a couple seismic lines and a 3D top-down seismic view showing the Sleipner field in the North Sea. And that illustrates a couple of things. One is how seismic is used to track the plume. So that's data that a CCS carbon storage operator would get, and then they would tune their subsurface dynamic simulation model, not just to honor the pressure, not just to honor the rates and everything. They would want to honor the size and extent of the plume. And so that seismic data dynamically feeds back in to the history matching process of your reservoir simulation so that you can ensure and show to the regulator you know where your CO2 plume is and you know where it's going to be in the future. And you can see that kind of effect change over time, and you can also see that really solid barrier, the cap rock seal over the reservoir there, where you don't see any change over time in the seismic surveys. So I'm certainly not a tax lawyer, but I just wanted to kind of briefly touch on some of the highlights of the 45Q tax credits. And right now, that's the main way that a carbon storage operation might end up receiving money, revenues from the federal level. There's not a domestic in the United States, a national price on carbon outside of this 45Q tax credit. And so I just wanted to bring it up here. So the key features of it are that it's basically a tax credit per metric ton that's either captured, and either stored in a pure storage sense or utilized. And usually that utilization implies EOR projects. From a qualified facility, and you get that credit for 12 years from when you put your capture equipment in service, and you got to put it under construction by 2026. So the difference between storage and utilization, storage is purely you're putting it away and you're keeping it away. That process, you get paid more for it, but it requires a new EPA Class 6 permit, and there's only a handful of those been issued to date. A few states have primacy to issue those permits, but most states, it's still going to the federal government. On the other hand, utilization EOR projects, they use a Class 2 permit. EOR and those Class 2 type wells have been around for decades and decades and decades. That's nothing new. And so you get more tax credit for the pure storage situations, but there are extra strings attached. Probably the most important, aside from the upfront permitting, is the fact that there's post-injection site care. So you're on the hook to monitor that site for 50 years after you stop injection to make sure that carbon is staying where it's supposed to stay. The capture equipment is what actually drives the credit generation. You don't actually get the tax credit for putting the carbon dioxide back underground. It's the person who either withdraws it from the air or captures it from an industrial process that actually gets the credit. Now, they can transfer that as partial payment for your services to inject, but it's the capture equipment that actually gets to claim that credit. So we've talked about the technical bits at a high level, and we've talked about one way that you can realize revenue for a carbon capture project. So now I just wanted to step through those pieces graphically and kind of illustrate how these cash flows might look. So on the cost side, E&P projects, this should be pretty straightforward. You drill some wells, you hire a pumper, you need to put in some flow lines, a separation facility, and then you're off to the races. For a carbon capture project, there's a large upfront expense for the capture equipment. There's also drilling your injection wells, transportation, compression, but the bulk of your CapEx up front is going to be related to the capture equipment. And that has a huge range of potential costs. And that range is driven by what you're pulling your CO2 from. If you're pulling your CO2 from a very pure stream, like an ethanol plant, which put off basically 100% CO2 from the bugs breathing, that's a relatively cheap process, maybe $75 to $100 million for a million ton a year kind of a separation process. If you're going the next step down the purity scale, maybe a cement plant, that's even more, maybe double that cost. If you go another step down the purity to some sort of combustion power plant situation, it's even more. Coal, even more step. Sorry. So basically, these CapEx is all up front. It's a little bit of geology, a little bit of site prep, but bulk of it's going to be on CapEx, on the capture facility. On the OpEx side, carbon capture is also pretty energy intensive. Again, that scales up with how pure your stream is. So relatively pure stream is going to have fairly low energy separation costs. More and more or less and less pure streams are going to have less and less cheap separation costs. And again, the other kind of feature of the carbon capture cash flow is that post-injection site care. So you can see after year 15, you're done injecting, you're not getting any more credits, but you've got some recurring OpEx for your monitoring and occasional seismic surveys to make sure that plume is where it's supposed to be. So the next piece of the puzzle is price. So oil prices, we can look at a futures curve, but who knows? It could go up or down. They can be very volatile depending on what current events are. On the other hand, carbon capture projects with the 45Q tax credits have a very defined revenue stream with those tax credits. It ramps up to that $50 a ton for storage, and then it's flat in real terms adjusted for inflation. So it's very well defined. There is some uncertainty what happens after 12 years. Is that cost of carbon really going to go to zero? Is there going to be no penalty to emit in 12 years from now? You know, I would say that seems less likely. So while there is some uncertainty as far as what happens after the 12 years, after these tax credits expire, you know, I would characterize it more as an upside opportunity than a risk. On the Flowstream side, you know, oil and gas projects tend to be front-loaded. Your wells come on strong day one, and they decline from there. On the other hand, your well-designed carbon capture and sequestration project is going to be relatively flat flow stream because your plant is not going to be going up and down, hopefully, in terms of its emissions, right? The best projects are going to be consistent emissions that you can consistently inject. You might lose a little bit of injectivity over the years, but you really want that to be built in to your capacity that you drill wells for. So when you combine all of these aspects, you get to your cash flow. And that's what this last row is, the cumulative net cash flow. So for an oil and gas project, again, because of the fact that you can start turning on wells as you drill them, your flow streams tend to be front-loaded. These E&P projects can lead to pretty attractive IRRs. This cash flow here, you know, not thinking of any basin in particular, but it's about a 50% IRR kind of a cash flow. On the other hand, with carbon capture storage projects, you've got big upfront costs. And while your flow stream is very steady, very stable, very predictable, which might be attractive to certain investors, it tends to lead to a lower IRR. So this kind of hypothetical project cash flow that I threw together is loosely based on the Illinois Decatur project with Archer Daniels Midland ethanol plant. And it kind of calculated out to something in the 10% IRR range. So it's more predictable, it's more stable, but it is a lower rate of return than you might see on a E&P project. So most people here are probably familiar with the PRMS, the Petroleum Resources Management System. The SPE has put out a storage resources management system which echoes the PRMS in many ways. They're really similar. Most of the language logic definitions follow the PRMS with storage capacity replacing reserves. Just like reserves, storage capacity in order to meet that definition has to be commercial. I mean, that can be from, you know, being paid to sequester carbon or taking advantage of the tax credits and the tax credits winding up to be more than it costs you to operate the facility. But the interesting feature that I really like about the SRMS is that it allows the definition of commerciality to extend to something that is a storage project that can be coupled with a revenue and CO2 generating project. And what that means is that the SRMS is sort of implying that there's a commercial benefit, a sort of goal that a company might pursue outside of dollars in terms of a license to operate or meeting net zero goals that meet the definition of commerciality, even if the act of sequestering the carbon costs more money than you can take in tax credits. You know, we haven't actually been putting out reports to these SRMS definitions yet, or we haven't been asked to yet. But you know, I think as we go forward and more investors are looking to deploy capital in the ESG investing in the green space, carbon capture projects are going to start needing this SRMS to help investors distinguish between projects. If you're looking at a universe of projects, how do you know which carbon capture sequestration project is better, less uncertainty, less risk? And these sorts of definitions will really enable investors and independent evaluators to speak in a uniform language and compare apples to apples when they're looking at different projects. So to wrap up, you know, I think we kind of started out talking about the exponential growth of ESG interest, and so there's a clear trend of investors pushing to go green. The International Panel on Climate Change puts out a bunch of pathways on how, you know, the world as a whole can meet climate change goals, and most of these pathways use billions of tons per year of stored CO2, billions. And, right now, globally, we're orders of magnitude away from that. So this carbon capture and sequestration, it will allow us to continue using the fuels that we already are, that we have all this infrastructure for, and still achieve these net zero pathway goals. A lot of the activity that's still going on, or that's currently going on, the most advanced projects are still kind of receiving some form of government support, and not so much the EOR. I'm talking more about the pure storage stuff. Either that's in forms of grants from the DOE to move a project along, or even loan guarantees. And that government support's been declining over time, but it's still present. And that's essentially because the combination of carbon policies, the amount of money you can receive for sequestering carbon, and the capture technology, how much it costs to capture that carbon and sequester it, they're still too immature. The combination of those two is still too immature to justify organic, widespread, everybody sequestering all of their carbon. But I think it's closer than a lot of people realize. Any change in either of those, on the revenue side or on the technology side, could open the door to adoption in a new industry, moving from ethanol to cement to power plants. And so with that said, industry, I think really our industry needs to be prepared for those shifts when they come, and develop capabilities where it makes sense today. And so what does that mean? I think companies should really understand what their storage resources are with the pore space they own or have leases on. How much carbon could they put into that pore space? How much would putting that much carbon in that pore space be worth? Are there looking more regionally, are there potential partners in the area? Ethanol plants, cement plants, power plants. Knowing the landscape that your assets are located in from a carbon emissions standpoint will put companies in a better position to take advantage of shifts in either the carbon policy framework in America or in the technology side, should they occur. The companies that are ready with all that information already at their fingertips are going to have an advantage moving on those opportunities.